Right then guys, in today's video we are going to be checking out tanks that you should definitely avoid in World of Tanks console. That is for Modern Armour. We're going to look at all of the different kind of tanks. We're going to give an opinion on some of them, and of course there'll be the tech tree lines going from tier 3 all the way up to tier 10 and for a variety of different tank lines. Of course, leave your comments in the comment section down below as to what tier 10s you really don't like either, and that you should probably avoid if you could go back in time, or potentially if you're currently grinding through a tech tree line and you're finding it one of the most horrific to go through. So I think first things first, we're going to start it off with the Russian tech tree line. Now, yeah, it can't really be said that many of the Russian tech tree tanks are particularly awful, but it can definitely be said that there are some terrible ones in there, and yeah, they are few and far between. First one's gotta be the K91. The K91 is just one of those tanks that just doesn't really cut it in today's meta. Yes, there will be people that enjoy this tank, and any tank within World of Tanks console can be used correctly, it can be used to good effect, but for the most part, you know, if you play this over something like the Object 430, you're going to be at a significant disadvantage. If you play the K91 over something like the Object 430U, you're going to be at a significant disadvantage. And that's kind of where this video is coming from, a place whereby, you know, you're looking at how they compare to the other tech tree tanks and whether or not you should get them out of the regards to different tanks within the tech tree. And certainly the K91 just doesn't compare to the other two. If you do have to get this tank, or, you know, because of Wargaming's stupid new system whereby you have to research a specific tank before you get any of the other ones, I'm just trying to save you some silver as opposed to just buying it. It's probably not worth paying the silver straight away. You're better off actually saving it till you get the ability to buy something like the Object 430 or the Object 430U, and that's just kind of how it goes. How is the tech tree actually leading up to it? Well, yes, they did get buffs, as with the K91, but they weren't considerable enough to really make them that competitive within the game. I just don't think the armor model of the tank really works, and when you compare it to the other Russian mediums within the game, it just doesn't work very well. I find the other tanks within the tech tree, 430 version 2 can be really, really nice to actually play for once. And certainly it got buffed, so it means that it's going to be more competitive. You're looking at tanks like the Object 416, okay when you're fully upgraded. Understand that, you know, tanks when they first are in the game, you know, stock, and you've not upgraded them whatsoever, they tend to be pretty shocking. So yeah, I don't particularly think the stock grind on this line is that good. I have played them on a different account, so yeah, although I may not have played them on this account, I have actually had a go with them, and yeah, definitely the 430U is just a different kind of, it just hits differently on World of Tanks console. But other than that, I think there are a few other tanks to kind of mention, and those just have to be the IS-4 line. Yes, the IS-4 is actually a lot more competitive now than it used to be, but I think it's the tech tree before it. Yes, they did get buffs as well, as with the most recent buffs in update 7.1, I believe it was, when they rebalanced pretty much like 80 tanks or whatever it was. But essentially what happened is that the majority of the tanks in the line from the tier 7 onward, so not the T150 but the KV3, they all got somewhat of a buff. For the most part, yes, the IS-4 has become a lot more competitive, the armour kind of works a lot better, the logs on the side of the tank no longer count as hitboxes, which could be penned by enemy tanks, because that's a really good feature from Wargaming right there, that you could actually get damaged by people hitting the logs, which essentially have zero armour. Yeah, just ridiculous that was even in the game. That got fixed, so yeah, your armour can kind of work now. Is it particularly the most overpowered tier 10 heavy? No, not particularly, but it is competitive now. However, the tech tree line before it, the ST1, the KV4 and the KV3, they're all pretty awful, and so if you want to save your sanity and you want just to get an IS-4 that is essentially not got as good armour, but is very, very competitive, and the tech tree line is quite nice to actually grind, then yeah, play the Object 277. It's a fantastic tier 10 heavy / medium tank. It basically acts as both. You've got really good mobility, you've got a really, really accurate gun, even though for a heavy tank that is not necessarily overall. But then you compare the tanks before it, the IS-3 being fantastic, the T-10 being amazing, the IS being really, really strong at tier 7, much, much better than the KV-3. In fact, immeasurably better than the KV-3. And then you've got like the tech tree line before it, the KV-85, probably better than the T-150. Yeah, it's just basically all round a better tank. And of course, if you go down this line to begin with over the KV-3 line and the IS-4, etc., you'll actually be able to get 3 tier 10s if you go the right kind of route, which is essentially to go to the IS and then you can go to the ISM or you can go to the IS-3. And then it's really just branching off of that. If you go towards the IS-3, that's kind of the route that I would go to, because the IS-7 and the Object 277 are probably the better of the 3 or 4 heavy tanks at tier 10 for the Russian line. So yeah, definitely go towards that. It's just a better than the IS-4. And I think that should kind of be mentioned within these videos, that there are often better routes and better tanks to get first. So if you're in it to just have fun and really not have to stress too much about the fact you're playing an awful tank like the KV-4 and the KV-3, then yeah, definitely go that route. And yeah, it just enables you to play multiple different tanks within that tech tree much easier without having to grind through the low tiers, especially if you don't want to do that. I think the next kind of area that we're going to have to talk about is the TDs, and of course we've got to look at the Object 263. This tank is just pretty much garbage when you compare it to the other tanks. Doesn't get the alpha of the big alpha guns in the Object 268 version 4, the Object 268 version 5, and the Object 268 standard version, which all get, 650 plus. This one gets 550. It's got better DPM, but of course the problem with that is that you sacrifice pretty much everything. Armor does not work on this tank. Yes, you may have some frontal armour that is fairly well angled, but the gun mantlet gets penned every single time. The side armour is absolute paper to the point where you're going to get penned every time. Lower plate is actually fairly thick, but it's definitely easy to get penned by pretty much anything firing premium rounds. So yeah, the Object 263 doesn't work how it really is intended in terms of being that all-out brawling tank that you can just pump out damage without being penned from the front. If you want that kind of tank, go for the Object 268 version 4. It's just a better tank. Unfortunately, in terms of, the way it goes with Wargaming is they give you the worst tank first in terms of how you research it. Really annoying that you can't choose which tank you want to get first, because that should actually be 100% a feature in the game. But of course, my name's Wargaming. We're on console. We've got to do something different, because apparently it's a different game, although it is still World of Tanks, and yeah, don't quite know why they do that. Used to be the system whereby, you get a tier 9, you can pick which tier 10 you want to get first, but yeah, Wargaming, no, they don't do that anymore for some unknown reason. Basically, probably just a way of getting you to spend more gold to convert your XP to be able to purchase the tank that you actually want, rather than grinding through the terrible one that you have to get first and then you have to get the second one. Just unbelievable the way that they kind of go with that route. I hope that changes. Don't know if it will. Probably won't, because console's a different game apparently. Anyway, moving on from the badgering and complaining, we will move into the German tech tree. There's a few German tech tree tanks that they're definitely pretty average or pretty awful. I think there'll be no real complaints when I bring in the Panzer KPFW 7. This is a tank that, oh god, it's supposed to be this side-scraping heavy tank. Let's just kind of show you the armor model. Well, if you decide to side scrape, of course, side scraping being this basically, and then your turret kind of moves into the in-line with the screen so that your turret is at like a 20-degree angle or whatever it is, aiming straight down towards us. Well, then you can basically poke around a corner and you can increase the armor effectiveness. They can't see the frontal lower plate weak point that a lot of tanks have, and so yeah, that's kind of how side scraping works. However, with this side scraping tank, in quotation marks, yes, I just did a air quotation there, but essentially the left hand side of this turret, so the bottom left of the turret, you see this kind of area shaded in like a darker green. I don't know if it will actually just show on the model, but it's all one colour. But you can see just where the turret is, where it meets into the turret ring. That is basically a big weak point. It's kind of the area just below the turret. Unfortunately, can't actually highlight it for you, but it's essentially, yeah, just an area which gets penned. If you angle like this, it just becomes not angled whatsoever, and people just go through it every single time. As well as that, the gun mantlet is pretty much awful as well, so people go through that by penning it. Because it's only 120 millimeters thick, meaning that yes, you can actually pen the gun mantlet of the Panzer KPFW because it's not actually spaced armor, it's actual armor, so a lot of people will pen you there. And then you have the cupola on top as well, and the lower plate, which yes is fairly strong, but a lot of the time if it's a premium round coming into the lower plate, you're going to get penned anyway. Just an awful tier 10 heavy really, that relies on side scraping, doesn't have the alpha damage to kind of deal with some of the heavy tanks that you're going to be coming up against, something like an E100 or maybe that brawling tank destroyer that is blatantly overpowered now in the T110E4. Yeah, it just doesn't ever compete against those sort of tanks in a brawling kind of scenario because the armor model doesn't work, and yeah, that's what the tank is designed for, and if it doesn't actually work as it's fit for, then it's not a good tank. Yes, you may get the occasional person that can do really well in this tank. I know most players can actually have good games in a certain tank. I can have a good game in the AMX Chaffee, doesn't mean it's a good tank. Yeah, it just really does depend on your opinion, but that's my opinion on the Panzer 5 or the Panzer 7. Of course, the tank line leading up to it, once you get to the tier 9, you start realising that these side-scraping German heavies are terrible in the fact that it just gets penned in the turret for the most part. Yes, you do have the side armor being actually fairly bouncy if you're side scraping, but yeah, the turret of the tank, especially when it's stock, is awful. Lower plate gets penned every time if you're frontal on, which I guess is kind of the bit that you're trying to be hiding by side scraping. But how often do you get into a map that is a town map currently on console, and how often can you actually use this side scraping meta within the game? Well, it's probably not that much, and the amount that you risk for it, yeah, it's just not really worth it. Yes, the tanks before it aren't particularly the worst in the VK4502A and the, well, let's not even count the Tiger P, that is a pretty awful tank. Yes, you can have good games in the Tiger P, it got slightly buffed with the most recent update, but essentially it's a worse Tiger with worse DPM. Yes, it has more armour, it's slower. You're not going to be able to go as fast. You don't have as good view range, I don't believe. You also have pretty much... it's just annoying, essentially, because the armor doesn't actually really work. Yes, you can pull off a bounce, but essentially you're going to be getting penned pretty much the same amount, and you're going to be dealing less damage in the same amount of time. So yeah, not really a tank I particularly enjoyed. It might be slightly better with the updates, but there we go. I guess that's kind of the whole tank line for you. To be honest, the armor just doesn't really work at all. Now, I think that there's probably a few more to go through in this one. We have maybe looking at the Waffenträger Alpha 100. To be honest with you, I don't think that this tank is very good anymore. I think that the whole autoloader getting nerfed so that it only has like 3 shots in the 15 and it only has like 4 shots with the 155mm. I can't remember anyway. It basically got nerfed to the point where you sacrifice so much in having a paper turret, and that your autoloader is pretty awful now, and your reload is horrific, and the armor on the hull is an E100 and it can get penned really reliably. It just is so huge as well. It's an artillery target, doesn't have armor. Yeah, it's just not a tank I want to play. Slow. You're better off playing the Gorilla. That's kind of how it goes. The tank line leading up to it, really fairly decent. The Borsig Stura Emil was actually a tank that is kind of underrated when you get the Top Gun on it. It has like 500 alpha at tier 7, really nice to pump people and use the gun depression of the Hoover that it kind of is, and the Nashor and things like that. They were all fun to play, but essentially, yeah, the Waffle E100 is no longer its broken tier 10 as it used to be. Moving on, British line, I think we'll probably put this into 2 parts. Maybe we'll do one half and then another half later on as a second video, and you can kind of see how that goes, and then go on to that video maybe the next day. But essentially, I don't think that there's particularly any British tanks that you probably want to avoid. I'd say the FV215B is probably the worst heavy tank for the British line, but it's not a terrible one, and you can have good games. Both the medium tanks are fantastic in the Action X and the FV4202. Badger, I think it's probably the one out of the two that you don't really want to get first. But yeah, I'd suppose if you enjoy that kind of frontal armour that doesn't really work, but it's kind of like that 263 that we mentioned. If people load premium, you're basically useless from the front in terms of the armour. You just don't want to sit in front of the Badger because of the DPM that this thing gets. I think it's slightly better than it used to be. I think it got a little bit of a buff, as with the Tortoise, but yeah, I don't think that it's going to be super overpowered. FE215B183, of course, probably the better of the two, just because you can dirt people for 1,100 or 1,450 with Hesh. It's just much more fun. Yeah, I think that's kind of that kind of line. I don't think there's any awful ones within there. They all kind of have an opinion of being able to be used, but essentially they'll be fairly decent. As far as the French line, yes, I may not have gone down every single one, but you're probably looking at things like the AMX-30B. It's kind of like a Leopard 1, but worse. It's kind of like an FE4202. It's that style of medium with a 390 Alpha, but it just doesn't really work very well. It goes fairly fast. You're going to be able to have good games, but it probably is one of the ones you want to avoid going down first. You're probably more likely to be going to the AMX-13105, having a bit of fun in the light tanks, or the Batchat 1225T, or essentially if you want a fast tank that's kind of really fun, it's the AMX-50B as a heavy tank is really nice as well. Currently going towards that on this account, not that far away from the 5100, and I'm sure you'll see videos coming out fairly soon. Tank destroyers are really good, Foch 155, but essentially that's kind of those. We'll go up to the USA and then we'll end the video for part 1. And we'll go over a few of the tanks in this. So there aren't particularly an amazing amount of terrible tanks from the USA line. Granted that the Wargaming headquarters is in the USA. I wonder why. But there we go. With the T110E3, probably the worst one. Tech Tree line coming up to it. There's some underrated tanks in there. T95 is... I wouldn't say it's underrated, but I don't think people realise how actually good this tank is. They understand that it's pretty good, but it is actually super good. Now, the armour model really does work. Essentially, that can't be said for very many tanks in the game. Yes, people, if they hit your weak points in the cupolas or that very under lower plate bit that is so slim, yeah, you can get penned. But the damage that this deals in the amount of time that it does, you can rack up 750 damage consistently against anyone you come up against. You got 320 pen with your premium rounds, 276 with your standard, meaning you don't even need to fire premium. Yeah, it's just unbelievable. You bounce quite a lot. Essentially, the kind of negative is that you're slow, but when you compare that to something like the T110E3 that goes up a tier, you're going to be constantly facing tier 10s, and it's just kind of worse. Yes, you get some more hit points. Yes, you get a little bit more alpha damage and more pen. Yes, a little bit more top speed. But when you then compare it to the E4, which got a turret buff and a lower plate buff, and the damage is the same, you get 50 less hit points, it goes an extra 11 kilometers an hour forward. There's no reason you'd play the E3, to be honest with you, anymore. In terms of the armour, people always make that thing, well, the E3 from the front is impenetrable unless someone decides to fire premium rounds, and then it becomes pointless, and then you're just another E4 that can't turn a turret. That's essentially what it is. The E4 cupola is now ridiculous, yeah, even less of a reason to play the E3, and that's kind of where I would go with that. Definitely the tank line leading up to the T110E4 is a little bit horrible at the tier 7, but that's essentially where it stops. T30 is fun to play, not super overpowered, but it's fun to have 750 alpha damage with the Top Gun on the T30. And yeah, it was a good one. I did decide to 3-mark it. Kind of did that whilst I was actually grinding towards the E4, so it was just an essential add-on. And then T28 prototype, of course, it's a little bit horrible to play, but when you're stock anyway. But when you get fully upgraded, it's not as bad. not as bad as the T28 or the T25AT or the Jackson, comparatively tier for tier. Like, yeah, I just think that you'd be better off as a new player going towards the E4. It's a little bit more forgiving as well. As far as anything else, I think that's pretty much it, where the USA line ends badly, I guess. Yeah, all of the rest of them pretty overpowered. There's not really any tanks in there that I wouldn't recommend going towards. Any of them really do have an option. Yeah, it's just up to you where you decide to go in those tech trees. Now, that will be the end of this video, so let me know what you think about all of these top nation tanks. And of course, in the second part of this video that you'll be able to see at the end or on screen right now, we'll go through the USA, Japan, Czechoslovakia, Sweden, Poland, and Italy, and the mercenaries. So there we go. Let me know in the comment section down below what you think, and of course, thank you very much for watching to this point, and I hope to see you in that next video. Goodbye.